Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to my next project plane. So we're going to be working on this Excalibur, making a bunch of changes on it. But welcome back to how to install a turbine engine. Alright guys, so now with the engine installed, next thing we're going to focus on is running the fuel tubing up front and also the primary engine connector. So we'll plug the engine connector in. That's fairly simple. There's a male and female side. It only fits one way, and it's you can see the way it's designed there. Hopefully it only goes in one direction. So we'll get that installed just like that. That's going to run forward, and there's little holes in the fuselage. Now the next thing I want to focus on is the fuel tubing. Okay, so maybe you'll be able to see this, but this has a pretty rough cut on this piece of fuel tubing. The square cut when you're doing press fittings is extremely important. So you want to make sure you have a good set of tubing cutters. Yes, you can use a razor blade or a razor knife and try and do it square, but it doesn't do as good of a job as a nice set of tubing cutters. So that's the tubing cutter. I know this is nice and square now and works really, really good. So we'll take the stopper out of the fuel port. This would have been something that would have been smart to do beforehand. Alright, so that's out. Now we'll take our cut end, which I can tell just by looking at it, that's the cut end, and we will get that inserted. Okay, there we go. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to run these two pieces up towards the front of the fuselage, and then we'll focus on the front of the fuselage section. Alright guys, so we've got everything mounted on the turbine tray. We've got the ECU data relay module mounted. The cable coming out there goes underneath and goes to the back of the fuel pump, or the power lead on the fuel pump. We've installed one of the on-off valve holders here. The plane didn't have one before. And then we've got the fuel pump here, or the fuel pump and fuel filter. So the fuel filter, basically you want after the pump. You want the on-off valve after the pump as well too. Now I have seen some manufacturers that recommend the on-off valve on the intake side of the pump, which would be this side. I think it was Jet Central on the L39 build, and that's the way I ended up installing it because there are recommendations, but we later changed that. But anyways, yeah, on-off valve, in my opinion, goes after the pump, the feed line that goes to the turbine. Okay, so that's the way we've got everything plumbed. Now this is essentially ready to install. This cable here on the Kingtech is the solenoid on the fuel pump. That needs to run to the P valve input right there. So we'll run that later on. But anyways, that's all installed, ready to go. Let's talk quickly about the fuel filters and how these things work. Okay, so if this is your fuel filter here, there's going to be an element in there. Okay, so the elements, let's just call it a bucket, or let's think of it like a bucket. Okay, so you want the fuel flow to go from the outside of the bucket to the inside of the bucket. That's how you want the fuel filters to work. Okay, so if this is the input on that fuel filter and this is the output on that fuel filter, your fuel filter should be installed like that. Okay, you do not want the fuel flow to go in the bucket to the outside of the bucket. That's the wrong way, and you can run into some issues if you install the fuel filter the wrong way. Now thankfully with the new Kingtech filters, there's an arrow on it, and that shows you the correct direction. But if you don't have a Kingtech filter or you're using any other brand of filter, just remember that. That's an important step. All right, guys, next step in the process here is we have to tie wire all the connections. So any connections that are a press-on type fitting, I tie wire. You probably don't need to because of the nice barbs on some of these things, but I always do it anyways. It's a little bit of safety, and I think it's a great idea to do it. Doesn't take long at all. So about 10 years ago when I got into the hobby, I bought this, I think it's 1 pound of 0.020 aircraft stainless steel lock wire. I still have it. It's probably half full, I think. I don't know. Anyways, good purchase. I think it was $25 at the time at an aviation store. Okay, so this is how I tie wire things. Obviously start with a piece of tie wire, and you want to do a double wrap. So you don't just go around once and tie it. You want to double wrap things. Like this. Trying to make this visible on the camera is not always easy. Okay, I know there's a tool to twist this. I don't own the tool, so I use these little forceps, locking forceps, and they work really well. So I just get the tie wire in place, give it a spin till it's almost closed, get it in the final spot. And I'll try and do a close-up here for you. So you can definitely overdo this and you can snap the wire. So I just go till it's snug. You kind of get the feel for it like that. And then I cut it off so it's a little bit long. And then when I do this, I know I've done this in previous videos, but I always bend it to the non-critical side. So the non-critical side being if we got a hole back here from rubbing, it would be fine. If we got a hole on this side, the critical side, then it would not be fine. So that's just a small little detail that I do. So I'm going to go through and lock this one, and then we will probably get this piece installed, and we'll work on the UAT and that stuff. All right, guys, so here's the basic layout of how this tank system works in this particular plane. So this is exactly how it's set up in this Excalibur. So let's start off with filling the system full of fuel. So we have the UAT, which is your bubble trap, right? So there's 3 lines on the UAT. We've covered that already. So we start filling through the fill line. It starts filling up. And because we have the on-off valve closed, because the solenoid valves are closed on the turbine, no fuel comes this way to the turbine. But we do have fuel going through this line into the tank. And as the tank fills up to the top, it comes out of the vent line onto the outside of your plane, okay? So that is the basic setup of how we're working on this particular plane. If you were working on a plane where you had another fuel tank installed, it would look like this. So let's say this was tank number 1, and over here, tank number 2. So the exact same thing is going to happen. We are going to fill. Always think about the system. This is the way I think about it. Filling, okay? So you're filling the UAT. It's filling tank number 1. Then it's coming out of the vent over here to tank number 2. And it's going to fill through the clunk line, the fuel supply line, and when this tank's full, it's going to come out of the vent line to the outside of your plane. Okay, so that's like a 2-tank setup. And if you have 3 tanks, 4 tanks, you're just adding on to that. So that's how a multi-tank setup works. Of course, there's many different styles of setups, but this gives you something basic to look at. Now, when you're running the system, the center port or the filtered port on the UAT is the suction side of the pump, and then the output side of the pump goes to the on-off valve, filter, turbine. So that's kind of the basic fuel tubing or setup for the turbines. Of course, your manual is going to be the best solution for this if it's anything different. All right, so in this plane, guys, we have reinstalled the UAT, the mount is reinstalled, and everything is nice and solid. We've used a zip tie this time to hold the UAT down, and it works really, really well. All right, guys, so we've put the tray back in place. I did have to disconnect the cable going between the ECU data terminal to the fuel pump, just because obviously it can't go. There's a former right here that this tray sits on, so it had to go through the hole. So that's been done. So for now, I'm not going to screw this in place. I'm just going to wait till we get everything placed. But now the board has been installed. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run this cable. Now I want to keep these cables as short as possible, but I also want to make it manageable if we have to take this tray out for any reason. So I'm probably going to leave this really close to that length, except I'm thinking about putting another plate across right here. So I'm just going to make it just a little bit shorter, probably something like that. So I'm going to cut about 1.5 inches off this tube. I'll get it installed, and then I will tie wire that. All right, guys, so we're going to toss the battery in the plane here. So this is the standard Kingtech 3800 battery. Put some sticky or fuzzy Velcro on this side. Now I'm going to put the battery in here because I know it already needs to go there, and we've already balanced the plane. If this was a new install, obviously we check with our manual and things like that and play with CG, but we know this needs to go right there. Now, because this is a basically a life battery, no problems charging that in the aircraft, so that's why we're using Velcro to stick that down. And then what we'll do is we will run the battery leads back here. So when you're charging, you can easily get to the leads, no problem. Finished running the other leads to the data terminal. So we've got the battery connection, which is right here, which is in the center. The pump right there, which we ran before, and then this is the bus cable coming from the turbine, which we've plugged in. So essentially the connections, the major connections on the data terminal are done. We still have the GSU, which is your screen, your ground support unit. And then we've got our throttle channel from the receiver on this particular one goes in the far slot over there. So we're going to get those run as we get things tidied up. And we have a little bit more plumbing left to do here, but I'm going to run the battery cables up to the front here, and we'll get that sorted next. All right, so I have put one screw in the tray here, put the tank back in. Now I'm not going to go too crazy, guys, because we are doing more work on this plane, as I've mentioned. So we're going to be installing new gear and things like that. So this will not be a pretty finished install, but we are going to do all the turbine stuff, okay? So I've left a little bit of excess fuel tubing at the back here, so you can see the bend in the 4mm line. So we'd be able to take this turbine, lift it out, and then be able to disconnect the fuel tubing. So that's what I did there. I just connected the line to the on-off valve. So let's run through this fuel system just like we did on paper. So the vent is here, and the vent line actually comes right outside of the fuselage right there. So I've got that kind of bent around and going outside the fuselage. So it comes in the vent, out the fuel line, which is here, to the UAT, which is here, and then to the pump and to the turbine. So that's a little bit different view on how things are plumbed compared to filling the tank like we talked about before, but that's the path for fuel. So my connection to the UAT to the fuel or the tank is this one right here. Now these lines are all sized appropriately for a 160 Newton turbine. I mean, this is all I think the 5/32 Festo tubing, so it's all the larger size Festo tubing, which works great. On something like a 210 and up, I would suggest the larger tubing, so 8mm Festo tubing or the large Tygon. Sorry, I think I called this Festo tubing. I meant Tygon. Anyways, so that's just something to consider when you're installing the various sizes of turbines. So all I need to do is connect this to that little nipple there, and our fuel system will be complete. Now I'm going to leave this a little bit long because I'm going to redo this connection at some point when we do the other repairs on this plane, but that's the next step that I need to do. And then really the only last thing to do is kind of finish up some of the last little tidbits here. All right, guys, so everything is hooked up. We hooked the tank up to the UAT there. Now, as I mentioned, I didn't tie wire this. I will because I'm going to cut this fuel line quite a bit shorter when I do the final install. Okay, so let's just go over all the installation just to make sure we are 100%. Now, of course, this is something I would suggest doing with any install. So like as we're treating this as a new install, that's what we'll do. So, okay, so we're starting back at the turbine. Turbine's installed. We have it fastened down. There's no pipe on this turbine. Actually, let's talk about pipe here for a second. And I'll draw a diagram for you guys, and that'll explain a little bit about the pipe to turbine dimensions here. Okay, guys, so here's the basic diagram here of your turbine and pipe. Okay, so this pipe has no bell mouth, and the normal distance between the tail cone and the entrance of the pipe is about 25 millimeters. Now you'll find some manufacturers will vary slightly, 20 millimeters, 30 millimeters, but 25 millimeters is, in my opinion, a good starting number. Now remember, that does not take into account your bell mouth. Okay, so if you have a bell mouth on your pipe turbine setup, you're still doing 25 millimeters-ish from the tail cone to the entrance of the pipe. Okay, you're not doing 25 millimeters from the bell mouth to the tailpipe. So just something to think about with pipe spacing. Okay, so our turbine's installed, our plug's in, we've got our fuel line run. There's no fuel to the fuel line, so that's something we have to do in the next step. Okay, everything's installed, FOD screen's installed because it's part of the turbine, so that part is good. Now we've got our fuel line and our cable coming to the front here, and we've got our fuel line going to the on-off valve, then to the filter, then to the output side of the pump. Okay, and then the intake side of the pump is going to the UAT, so that portion is correct. As far as the fuel system goes, that's correct because we haven't changed anything in the airplane, and we've already discussed that. Now, as far as the connections go, our battery is not connected yet, but there's our battery connector. I love this new setup on the Kingtech G4s because it's super simple, so all those are in the right direction. Now, when we look back at our servo plugs here, the far right-hand side of our current view is the signal line. The far left is the negative. So we've got the GSU plugged in the correct way, the P valve or prime valve plugged in the correct way, the RX throttle or cable coming from the radio is plugged in the right way as well. So that stuff's all plugged in correctly. So now I can turn this thing on and we can do our first essential checks on this turbine. All right, guys, so everything's plugged in, powered on. What we need to do is we need to learn the radio to the turbine, and then we need to prime and test everything. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to learn the radio. Now, of course, every manufacturer is going to be a little bit different, but we'll go through the Kingtech one here. So radio. Next, RC learn. Okay, so we're going to hit enter, stick up, trim up. Stick down, trim down. Stick down, trim up. Now, one thing you need to be sure of, it depends on your radio system, but if I go all the way, so my throttle trim goes from minus 200 to plus 200. If I go all the way up to 200, then it actually doesn't work. So I've got it set right now so it's moves 100 per click, and that's just the way the radio is set up. Just be mindful of that, because if you're not aware of that and you're going all the way up, that's going to mess things up with your trim system. If you have any questions, consult the manual because it explains it in there, or list your question down below. Okay, so everything's programmed. We like to fly on half expo, so we'll leave it there. And that's it. So we'll push the home button. Now we're going to go to tests and just go through this turbine. Now we have put 2 cycles on it for the test videos and the review videos. That's why it says 5 minutes, 2 cycles. So we'll go next, next. So we're going to test the starter. No problem. Starter works good. Okay, we're going to test the glow plug. Now, you probably won't be able to hear it on the microphone, but when you push your glow plug, you'll hear it go kind of a whining, beeping noise. So it just goes buzz, and we just turned it off. Okay, now we're going to test the pump. The only problem is I don't have any fuel in this, so I got to put some fuel in the system, and then I'll be back with you guys. All right, guys, so we've got fuel in here, so we want to test the pump. So we got to make sure we open our valve. Okay, otherwise it's not going to work. And when we push the on button, the pump's going to start at a slow speed. And ideally we want the pump to suck in fuel and push it through the system, ending up down here. So basically we want to stop the fuel just as it comes to the engine down here. We don't want to go too far, otherwise we're going to be flooding the engine with fuel, and if you do that and you have a start, it's going to be a very hot start and you can burn things down. So all we do is turn the pump on. You hear the solenoid click. And then just as I see fuel coming to the engine, I turn it off. So that part's done. Test gas valve. So you can test these, you just turn them on and you'll hear them click. And you can hear them click closed as well. Okay, we'll test the fuel valve. And prime function, we don't need to do that. Okay, so that is that stuff. All right, so the last thing I'm going to go through before we do any tests on the turbine here is I'm just going to show you guys some of the things we're going to be doing when we do our first run-ups on this turbine. So I did the testing on this turbine and the pump power. So when you're running this engine, the GSU, or the data terminal, that shows you the pump power. So when this thing was idling, it was about 80 or 90, which is a little bit high. When it was at full power, it was like 500. Now, these 160 engines, I've noticed they do come with the 500 fuel pump, and I think the 160 that's in my Ultra Flash over there, right there, comes with the 600 fuel pump. So not that it's a bad thing, we just want to be something to be aware of. So that's one of the things we're going to be checking and adjusting. The other thing is going to be the ramp up and ramp down. So we want to go into the turbine. Okay, we want to go into the run menu. Okay, we'll cycle through this stuff here. Okay, so our acceleration delay is 12. Can't adjust that at all yet because we haven't set the pump max power. Our decel is also is at 12. Now our pump limit is 940, which if this is idling at 500, 940 is way too high. Okay, so when we drop this pump limit down, we can also change the accel and decel delays as well too. Now this engine will run totally fine with things the way they're set, but I want to show you guys how much better you can get this thing running if you just play with these things. Now, this is not something you should be doing if it's on another engine. Obviously, consult with your owner's manual, but I just want to go through this stuff because it can get you a better running engine, and it's also the right way to do things. So those are some of the things we're going to be playing with. I'm going to leave that the way it is now because when we did the test, so when we do a test run on the test stand, the fuel system's totally different than what we have set up in this plane. Okay, so it's important to, I mean, you can put it on the test stand, run it, but remember that you're not ultimately changing or permanently setting your settings until it's actually in the aircraft. Okay, so that's where we're at now. We need to do a test run on this thing as the next step. We're going to find out the idle pump power, the max pump power, and then we're going to add 20%. All right, guys, so before we run it up here, I just want to show you page 41 of the owner's manual talking about the pump power, etc. So this is the new G4 engine manual, but talks specifically about what I was talking about. So the pump power accel affects the accel and decel times. So you want to add about 15 to 20% of the max time or max pump power when you're running it. So right there in the manual. Number one, we have to do our first run up, and because we just learned the system to the radio, we have to let the idle stabilize. And then once the idle stabilized, we'll slowly go to the top of the throttle channel, let the max RPM stabilize, and then we will go through our ranges. Now, initially what I'm looking for here, number one is our idle pump power. Number two is our max throttle pump power. Those are the first two numbers that I want to find on our very first run up in the plane. This is important, like I've talked about before. It's got to be in the plane because your fuel system in the plane determines how much restrictions in the fuel line and stuff. The test stand's great, but you have to do it again with the actual plane setup. So that's the first thing I'm going to do, and we'll get those numbers. Okay, guys, we are ready to go and trim up. Fuel's open. Start initiated. There we go, we've got ignition. There's a few air bubbles still at the turbine. Okay, so while that's cooling down, I wrote down our numbers here. So we've got 84 for an idle pump power, 587 for max. So we're going to take our 587 times 1.2 gives us 704. So we want to set the pump power now to basically 700, the max pump power. Okay, so now that the engine's cooled off, we'll go in and we will adjust that max pump power. So we're going to go into the setup menu, turbine, running, and this is where it's going to be. So pump limit's at 940. As it says in the manual, the higher you have the pump limit over what's needed, the rougher things are going to run. So the closer you can get this to being where it needs to be, the better. So we're going to put this at 700. There we go. So just for giggles, because we can do it, we're going to drop the accel and decel delay to 10. And there we go. So I am not going to adjust these while the engine's running. You can adjust these while the engine's running. That's usually what I would do if I was at a flying field doing this, but I don't really want to run this again and piss off my neighbors too much. So I'm going to run it again just to see how different it runs, but I'm not going to mess around with the accel and decel delays. Basically, you want to drop those until you're comfortable at, from idle to full throttle. If you hear any chuffing or any funny noises, you've gone too low. And you have to be careful with that because you can get a compressor stall and you can get a flame out with it. So, if you're running it at 10, 8, 12, it all runs really well. So, but I'll run this one more time. We'll play with the accel and decel delays and see how it goes. Now, when you do change the max pump power, it's almost like you're relearning the throttle channel, so things are going to be different. If you just start this up and go to max throttle again, it's going to be different. It might be well below the max RPM, and it might take a while for it to get back up there. And I've had it a couple times where I've had to relearn my radio in order for that to happen. So we'll see what happens. Okay guys, so all I do now is I take those two numbers that we got, so 84 and 587, and I print them on my label maker. So I've got idle at 84, max at 585, and I just put this somewhere in the plane. And this is a nice quick check when you are getting ready to fly. So, when you're sitting there at idle just after starting it, your pump power should be really close to 84, like we found. When you do generally around here, we always do a max throttle check before we take off. That max throttle should be somewhere around 585. If the numbers are deviating a lot from this, something's going on. What can also happen is your pump can also be wearing in, and you may have to learn your radio to your turbine again to reset the numbers. So anyways, good little tidbit for you. I mean, you can write this in the plane. I just print the label because it's nice and clean, and we'll just put that right in this area beside the pump. All right, guys, so the only thing that really would be left to do in this plane would be to mount the actual GSU or data terminal. I want to mount that right here, so we're not set up for that, but of course you don't have to leave this in the plane. You can take it in and out as well too, and that's perfectly fine. All right, guys, so that is the basically the nuts and bolts of installing a gas turbine engine, and in this case a Kingtech 160 G4 engine. Everything went really well, exactly as I planned. The turbine runs great. The only thing that we may change is we might modify the accel and decel delays just slightly once we can get out to the field. But of course, we've got a long winter to wait for that to happen. So anyways, guys, if you have any questions about installing a turbine or anything you saw in this video, make sure you list them down below. Additionally, guys, there's lots of people that reach out to me, lots of friends, lots of people in the community, and they're like, "Hey, I didn't get your new notification that you got a new video out." And I asked them, "Hey, did you see this last video?" And they're like, "No, I didn't see it." So anyways, when you do hit that subscribe button, you can also hit the bell. And if you guys hit the bell and set notifications to be on, then you'll get notified when I release a new video rather than when YouTube thinks that they want to let you know that I released a new video. So don't forget to do that, guys. If it's your first time finding my channel, hit that subscribe button down below. Hit the bell as well. If you guys did like the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you didn't like the video, that's okay. Totally fine. Hit the thumbs down button, but do that twice because it works better if you hit it twice. So that's it, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, again, list them down below. We'll see you in the next video.